and I've got the honour of being the president of the Glossy Black Conservancy. And it's in that role I have the pleasure to welcome you all to the Conservancy's first National Glossy Black-Cockatoo Forum. Yeah!
Yay!
Before we begin today's forum, I, on behalf of the Conservancy, would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands from which we're all gathering. We wish to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. I'm coming to you from Quandamooka country in southeast Queensland. It's a special land where the casuarinas are sweeter and the glossiers are glossier, but we can debate that later today. We, the Conservancy, are very proud to be hosting this event, and it's a privilege to be here today to discuss the conservation of the Glossy Black-Cockatoo, a species that holds special and significant cultural and environmental values across its range. These events don't just happen, and it's without the support and commitment of those who contributed to making this event possible. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Conservancy as a whole, all of the management committee who are with us today, and specifically the Forum Organising Committee. Your dedication, hard work's been instrumental in bringing this forum together. Special thank you to all our speakers and panellists for sharing your knowledge and insights so willingly. I have no doubt that your contributions will provide valuable knowledge and learnings for everyone attending. On behalf of everyone involved in the Cockatoo Forum, I'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to you for making your precious time available to us. Lastly, I want to make specific mention and thanks to Samantha Morris and Ellie Webb from Wombat Creative, who provide the administrative support to the Conservancy. They're going to be beavering away behind the scenes during this event, making this all happen and bringing it all together for us. It wouldn't happen without their support, their dedication and commitment to making it. We thank you both quite sincerely. What you do for the Conservancy is invaluable. So everyone, please enjoy the forum, make the most of it through participation. And with that, I'd like to introduce Sam Morris, the Glossy Black-Cockatoo Conservancy's coordinator and the forum convener, to get us all underway. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Adrian, and welcome everybody. It's such a relief to have you all come online, because when you're organising a virtual forum like this, there's a lot of anxiety as to whether all of the communication has been clear, whether the time conversions work. So I'm just thrilled that you are all online and that so many of you have decided to join this opening session. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, because you will see me pop up throughout this event. I live on the Gold Coast, and I've been working in conservation and natural resource management for 31 years. And I've had roles with organisations like the Glossy Black Conservancy over that time, as well as state government, before starting my own consultancy, Wombat Creative. And I work with lots of other conservation groups in this space. And my expertise is definitely not around identifying the bird, which comes at great humour to the Conservancy. It's more around communication and engagement, no matter how many ID workshops I attend. As Adrian has said, the goal of this two-day forum is predominantly around connection. We're all doing critical work around conservation of the Glossy Black-Cockatoo, but we don't always have the opportunity to share with each other what we're up to and what we've learned and any of the challenges that we've encountered along the way. We are always stronger together. So the hope of the Conservancy is that the next 2 days is a step towards strengthening all of our efforts, as well as celebrating our successes and acknowledging the challenging environment that we continue to work in, but most importantly, building those connections that will help us keep on keeping on for the benefit of Glossy Black-Cockatoos and all of the threatened species we work with in Australia. So, some housekeeping notes. Please take this opportunity to update your Zoom name with your actual name and maybe the organisation or the location that you're from. If you don't know how to do that, in the little square that shows your name, there's 3 little dots on the right-hand side, and you can hit that square and go to rename and add to the name that's there in Zoom. I'd also like to give you a moment to say g'day in the chat, and a few people have already done that. Thank you, Nicole, who's on Yugambeh country. Harry Hackett's jumped in and said g'day. So if you don't mind just popping in the chat and letting us know you're there. It's also, for those of you who might not have used the chat, a good opportunity to just get into practice, because we'll be using the chat function for all of the Q&As that we do throughout the workshop. If you do have any questions throughout the next 2 days, the chat is the place for them. We will be facilitating those questions to our panels and our experts and our speakers. But if we don't get around to answering them, we will find ways to create some content and have those questions answered, whether it's some live Q&As with the speakers after the event, some social media posts, or maybe even some blog content on our website. And I also wanted to remind you that I know we're all very professional at the Conservancy, me especially, but we are a very grassroots organisation with very minimal resources. So we just want to thank you in advance for your patience if there are any technical difficulties, because like you, none of us are IT experts, and we're just doing the best we can with not being a funded organisation. That always comes as a challenge. All of the sessions over the next 2 days will be recorded, and they will be made exclusively available to you as people who've paid to register for 6 months before we make them publicly available. So we're endeavouring to edit those videos and get them out to you before Christmas, with the first videos being available in the next week or two. All of our speakers and facilitators, and even Ellie and myself, are donating our time for this event. So thank you to everyone who has paid to register, because that all goes into the conservation programs of the Glossy Black Conservancy, and we really appreciate that. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this first National Glossy Black-Cockatoo Forum. And it's funny how things kind of come full circle, because Dr Daniella Teixeira actually ran a forum quite similar to this, face-to-face, focused on black cockatoos a couple of years ago, and we've taken those evaluations and a lot of the learnings from that event and applied them to this one. Of course, we're doing this one remotely. For those of you who don't know Daniella, her keynote is going to be focused on what we don't know, monitoring population trends of glossy black cockatoos in southeast Queensland. And Danny is an absolute powerhouse when it comes to not just glossy black cockatoos, but conservation biology more generally. She is a conservation biologist and a research fellow at the Queensland University of Technology, and was awarded a PhD in 2020 for her research on the bioacoustics of glossy black cockatoos and red-tailed black cockatoos. Daniella's work has been featured in global media, most notably David Attenborough's documentary Breaking Boundaries, The Science of Our Planet. We call her the accidental pin-up girl for glossy black cockatoos, because we drag her out at every opportunity to be in front of a camera. Currently, Daniella co-leads monitoring programs for red-tailed black cockatoos in Victoria and South Australia, and glossy black cockatoos in Queensland. She is a very active member of the Glossy Black Conservancy and has been since 2016. And she led the recent revision of the Glossy Black-Cockatoo Conservation Guidelines, and was a co-author for the Glossy Black-Cockatoo and red-tailed black-cockatoo accounts in the Action Plan for Australian Birds 2020. Danny is a scientific member of the Glossy Black Conservancy and the Southeastern Red-tailed Black-Cockatoo Recovery Team. And beyond black cockatoos, Danny's research focuses on developing and applying acoustic methods for large-scale biodiversity monitoring. She is currently an ARC Industry Fellow, works closely with the conservation NGO Bush Heritage to research new tools for tracking ecological change through sound. She's also a good egg to boot. So please welcome Dr. Danny to deliver our first keynote for this forum.
Thank you, Sam, for that very kind introduction. I'll just try and share my screen.
And while Danny does that, please remember, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them throughout Danny's presentation in the chat, and we will pose them to Danny after she has delivered her presentation.
Can you see my screen?
We can. Yep, all good, Danny.
Excellent. And yeah, thank you, Sam and Ellie, for organising all of this. It's really, really exciting to be here, and it's so nice to see some familiar faces. So there's, lots of people here who I haven't seen in a very long time, and it's really, really nice to see that you're here and able to make it. So today I am going to be talking to you about some work that we're doing on monitoring the population trends of glossies in southeast Queensland, and probably more specifically what we don't know about this. So like Sam said, I am an industry research fellow at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, and I also work with Bush Heritage Australia, which is a wonderful conservation nonprofit that I'm sure many of you are aware of. I'd just like to start out by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. So this is where I'm based. And I'd like to recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Yugambeh country, from my home on the Gold Coast. I'd also like to give a very special shout out to my Black Cockatoo colleagues. So this is a photo, like Sam said, from the very first National Black Cockatoo Forum way back in 2018. I can't believe it was that long ago, where we all got together in Melbourne. And I put this up because honestly, so much of what I know has come from these people, and so much of my passion. And I have to especially give a shout out to Mike Barth, who I know is here today, and also Richard Hill, my colleague on red-tailed black cockatoos. Mike and Richard took me under their wing, so to speak, when I was a new PhD student, and I didn't know much about these birds, and I've learned so much from them. I'd also like to give a shout out to Kalia Barris, Gay Crowley, Guy Castley, Gabriel Conroy, Ian Ginther, Berent van Rensburg, Martine Marin, Leo Joseph, Stephen Garnett, and John Wojnarski. And of course, everyone at the Glossy Black Conservancy. You are all wonderful. So I'd like to start out this forum with the big question. So why save glossies? Why are we even here? Why have we come together? And this might seem a little bit of a strange question. And in fact, I think it is a bit of a strange question, but I put it up here because I get asked this question all the time. Post Black Summer, I did a lot of interviews with the media, with journalists, and I would often get asked this question. They would just say, tell me why. Why should we be saving glossies? Why should we care? And it stumped me a little bit. I felt like flipping the question on its head and saying, well, why shouldn't we save glossies? I mean, seems obvious to me. But I really struggled to articulate it beyond that. And I sort of came across this poem by an Australian poet, Mark Tredennick, a wonderful poet. And I think that what he describes here sort of gets at the essence of what I feel about saving glossies or any species. He says, with each dialect drowned, each lexicon beached, the world that is a universe of all these knowing realms knows less. The living world grows less alive. And we who cannot find a patch of ground we do not need to claim, a wildness we do not need to tame, fall deeper alone, the thicker we crowd the biomes, the thinner we shave the ways there are of being on this earth. And for me, that's what it's all about. It's not about the ecosystem functions of these birds, and it's certainly not about what they can do for me, for us. It's about this incredible complexity of life on Earth, and that anything we can do to save it, we should do. And any loss, any fragment that we lose is a real misfortune. So all of my work is sort of done through this lens. So I did my PhD on the Kangaroo Island Glossy Black-Cockatoo and the southeastern red-tailed black-cockatoo. So I focused specifically on the bioacoustics of their breeding. Since 2021, I've been focusing on glossies here in southeast Queensland, where I'm based. I have co-supervised various research projects on glossies, led various post-fire surveys for the Queensland government, and I've also been involved in various conservation plans and working groups. So just to give a really quick overview of the conservation status, I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but we currently have 3 recognised subspecies of glossies. This is debated. I'm told this may be revised, but for now, let's roll with this. So we have the Kangaroo Island subspecies, or the South Australian subspecies. So it is endangered, but the population has increased over the past few decades. So we think there's around 450 individuals. I'm not sure if that's the latest estimate. Maybe Kalia in her talk can give us an updated estimate, but we do have high confidence in that estimate because we're able to basically go out and count most of the birds on the island. The southeastern subspecies, which is the focus of this talk, is listed as vulnerable. The population is assumed to be declining, but we have low confidence in that estimate. And that is sort of part of what I'm speaking about today. And then there's the northern subspecies, which we know almost nothing about. So I just want to say that glossies have traits that make them quite vulnerable to extinction, and this is really important. So relative to other species, glossies have, long lifespans, they have long parental dependency periods, they're relatively late to reach sexual maturity, and of course, they are habitat specialists. So there's this really interesting paper from the 1980s where this author went back through museum records in South Australia and Victoria and tried to map the historical distribution of glossies and redtails. And really interestingly, he thinks that glossies once occurred all the way across to Melbourne, on King Island and on Tasmania as well. So there's some excerpts here from that paper. So there's a diary entry from the 1800s where the author writes that there were these large black cockatoos whose tails were elegantly adorned with transverse bands of a beautiful rosy hue. And then similarly on King Island, they say there's red tails, but possibly glossies. And then they say it's more likely to be glossies because the habitat was more suitable. And that's probably true. I mean, I haven't been to King Island, but I have been to Tasmania, and there's lots of drooping she oak, and it sort of reminds me so much of Kangaroo Island, and I can just picture glossies being there. So whether this is true or not, we can argue that, but I think it's definitely possible. And I think absolutely no doubt that their distribution has contracted over time. We do know that a few birds after Black Summer did get all the way across almost to Melbourne. So that does sort of make a lot of sense. We're not sure about the rest of the East Coast. Nobody that I know, I don't know of any other analysis like this, but I think definitely their population has contracted over time. So in 1999, HANZAB was published. So that's the Handbook for Australian and New Zealand Birds. And for the eastern subspecies, so southeastern and the northern subspecies together, they were just noted as rare. And then in 2010, we have the Action Plan for Australian Birds, where they provided a population estimate of around 10,000 mature individuals, probably declining, but again, low confidence in this estimate. And they say that there is no estimated total population number. So basically, we just estimated this from an expert committee. They then tried to sort of hindcast and estimate what the population status would have been 20 years prior, so at 1990, 2000, and then 2010. And at each of those time points, they were assessed as being near threatened under the IUCN criteria. So potentially the population was maybe stable throughout that 20-year period, even though it was already sort of almost meeting the criteria as being a threatened species, possibly not declining too rapidly over that time period. However, everything changed in Black Summer. That is no secret, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that in the next 2 days. So there were absolutely widespread impacts to glossies all over from Black Summer. So in 2020, we have the updated Action Plan for Australian Birds, and this work was led by Matt Cameron. I was involved in this assessment. So in that, we estimated that around 34% of the subspecies habitat was burnt. 10% experienced high or very high severity fire. And this kind of fire can actually lead to tree death and potentially an entire shift in vegetation communities, which can be, basically render an entire area useless for glossies. 15% experienced lower intensity fire. And the effects of this are unclear. And there is potentially some benefit to lower intensity fire. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm coming out here saying all fire is bad. That is certainly not the case, but we're not sure about the effects in this particular case. But altogether, we estimated that about 30% of the southeastern glossies habitat became unsuitable in that single event. So very, very dramatic. We then estimated that the overall population size was around 7,500 mature individuals, but again, low confidence. That said, we considered that the population met the criteria as vulnerable under the IUCN. And then similarly, under the EPBC Act, the subspecies became federally listed as vulnerable on the 10th of August, 2022. So this was certainly a bittersweet moment. Despite all of that, there's still a lot we don't know. So this may seem surprising, but we still have a poor understanding of glossies' conservation status. We don't have a good handle on total population size or population trend. Certainly with loss of habitat, habitat degradation, all of that, the population is most certainly, or almost certainly declining. I think I would definitely put my hand on my heart and say that, but we don't really understand the rate of that change, and we don't understand how that's varying regionally. We know almost nothing about their breeding. Very, very, very poor understanding of their breeding locations and success rates here on the East Coast. We know nothing about the survival of juveniles and adults. And in fact, we don't really have a good handle on what we consider critical habitat. And that is something that is going to become more and more important as we look to develop a recovery plan for the subspecies. So in this talk, I'm just focusing on population trends. And this has become a bit of a pet project of mine, because I think at the moment, the monitoring programs that we have are not sufficient for really tackling this question. And unfortunately, in many places, we just don't have any monitoring at all. Okay, so I'll talk to you now about our new project, which is bioacoustic occupancy monitoring of glossies in Southeast Queensland. So in 2021, we formed a project team. You can see all of our mugshots there on the right-hand side. I'd just like to give a shout out to all of my co-leads on this project. It's definitely a huge team effort. So we began this occupancy survey for glossies, and occupancy monitoring, for those of you who haven't come across this before, it's a slightly different approach to some other methods of monitoring wildlife. So the key difference is that it uses both presence and absence data. So it requires that you go back to sites again and again and again in a short space of time to basically confirm whether the species is absent. So instead of just using sightings data to model the presence of species, we're trying to kind of get both. And we do this because then we can account for imperfect detection. And what I mean by that is when the birds are present at a site, but we fail to see them, this actually mathematically allows for us to model that. So I hope that makes sense. So occupancy modeling is widely used in wildlife monitoring. I just put a screenshot there from a relatively old paper now on the swift parrots. And that's just to show that occupancy monitoring has been able to show the rapid decline of swift parrots. And of course, their status is critically endangered today. So it's a very, very powerful method. In terms of our design, so we had this area, Southeast Queensland, that you can see there. We basically overlaid Glossy Black-Cockatoo habitat mapping, which we're very lucky to have for this region, thanks to the Conservancy's effort. So we overlaid the habitat mapping, and then we sort of split all of that up into 1 kilometre square grid cells. We then classified each grid cell into a time since fire category. So you can see those categories listed there. And then we randomly selected 20 sites per category. So hopefully that makes sense. So our sampling frame is basically these grid cells within habitat. Super, super important. We did not bias our selection to any known hotspots. So this was completely random. We did not have any prior knowledge of where the birds occurred. We wanted to really take a representative sample of sampling across the region. So basically anything that could potentially be used by glossies was able to be selected in this random process. So the details of the bioacoustic monitoring, I'll touch on a little bit in my talk tomorrow. But just quickly, we used one Frontier Labs bar LT sound recorder per site. Bar LT sound recorders are my pick. If I have enough budget, these are the ones I would choose every day of the week. I think they're fantastic. So we had one of these per site. We left them out for a minimum of 7 days, and they recorded continuously from sunrise to sunset. And then at each site, we also did a transect to collect vegetation data. So we collected a whole range of data on trees, cones, and even the seeds. We, of course, looked for birds, listened for birds, and looked for their chewings. And then back in the office, we calculated a whole range of spatial variables. All of these sort of related to fire history, vegetation, and soil. And I'm still working through some weather data at the moment. So these were our working hypotheses. So we expected that Glossy Black-Cockatoo occupancy would be more likely where Clout's index was greater. And Clout's index, for those of you who haven't heard of that, it's a published index, and it's basically just a measure of seed weight to cone weight. So you basically collect some cones, take the seeds out of those cones and then take the ratio of the weight of the seeds to the cones. And in previous research, that has been shown to influence glossy black-cockatoos' feeding behaviour. We also thought tree density would be important. So where there were more trees, we thought they would be more likely. Similarly, we thought the proportion of adult female trees would influence their occupancy. Of course, adult female trees are the trees that produce the cones that the glossies eat. And then same thing for cones. So we thought that their occupancy would be greater where cone density was greater and where tree size was greater, because those two things together, of course, would increase the absolute number of cones available to the birds. In terms of fire, we thought that there would be some kind of sweet spot. So recently burned sites we thought would probably have lower occupancy because the trees might be really burnt, potentially have their canopy scorched, no food left. And then long unburnt sites we also thought might not be suitable. And I'd just like to point out some work by a former honours student of ours, Nick Del Zoppo, he did some work on Kangaroo Island. And in his work, he found that very long unburnt habitat did not have good food quality for glossies. So the trees were still holding their cones, but the birds were not feeding there. And then when we actually went and analysed the cones, they had very poor seed quality, basically. So they weren't really providing much of a resource for the birds. So we think that there is some kind of sweet spot in the middle in terms of fire. Okay, so the naive occupancy, so this is basically the raw data. So this is where it gets quite interesting. Before I show you these results, I just want to say that there was a huge amount of work in developing a machine learning recognizer, or AI, to help us automate the detection of the birds in the sound recordings. I could do a whole separate talk just on this, but I won't. Just suffice to say that for many, many, many months, me and another computer scientist at QUT, Dr. Lance Devine, we trained this machine learning recognizer again and again and again and again until it was performing exceptionally well. So this is what we then used to process all of our sound recordings, to look for glossies, and then I went and manually checked every single one of those hits. So hopefully that makes sense. So what did we find? So in the field, we found glossies at 3% of the sites. So remember, we only had 100 sites. So that, might sound a bit low, but that's probably to be expected because, these were a random selection of sites. We did find evidence of their feeding at more sites, so that was cool. 9% of the sites. Some of those chewings were fresh, some of them were a bit older. But in terms of the audio, we recorded them at 31% of the sites, which is amazing. And all of us on the project team were a bit shocked. It was truly remarkable because out there, this was a tough period. This was 2021, right after Black Summer, and we'd had droughts. The food quality wasn't looking so good. We weren't really finding birds. We were really, really concerned. Maybe 100 sites, wasn't going to be big enough. We're going to have no data. It was this whole thing. But when I processed the audio, I was like, man, they're here. They are here, and we're just not seeing them. So it's really cool. And I think this spectrogram image I put there highlights this very nicely. So a spectrogram is just a visualization of sound. So along the x-axis, we have just time into the sound recording. And then on the y-axis, we have kilohertz, which is so the frequency. So the higher the frequency, the higher pitched a sound would appear to us, to our human ears. And in the blue box is a glossy black-cockatoo contact call that our machine learning recognizer found. And that wasn't a bird that was far away. So this isn't some bird in the distance. This was actually fairly close. And it was just a soft contact call. So probably this bird was roosting with another bird, I'm guessing, up in the canopy somewhere just out of sight. No doubt it could see us when we were there doing our transect, but we weren't able to see it and there was no evidence of the feeding sign. But it just gave this one call in many hours, and it was only through these sound recordings that we were able to confirm their presence. So really, really cool. So after our surveys back in the office, we actually went back and recategorized our sites into new time since fire categories. And we had to do this because the actual location of our survey, so where we put the sound recorder and where we ran the transects, they had to kind of shift a little bit within those 1 kilometre square grid cells, because sometimes we got there and the habitat wasn't actually correct. So sometimes there was flaws in the mapping. And yeah, so we basically had to kind of maneuver it. In other cases, it was just unsafe. We couldn't sort of run a transect down the side of a cliff. So we had to shift that a little bit, which meant we then used, satellite fire data to recategorize the sites. Unfortunately, this led to an unbalanced survey design. So when we set out, we had 20 sites per category, so it was very nice and neat. So now we're sort of dealing with an underrepresentation of the really young, so the category 1 sites, and a slight overrepresentation of category 3 and 4. That aside, as a proportion, most glossy detections were in category 2, so as a proportion of sites within that category. And then there were similar proportions between category 3 and 4, which is at 5 to 20 years post-fire. I just want to say, importantly, these are just raw results, so I haven't actually, well, I have started the occupancy modelling, but I'm not showing those results here yet because we've still got quite a bit of work to do on that. So these are just sort of the raw data. In terms of Clout's index, like I said earlier, previous research has shown Clout's index to differ between feed and non-feed trees and by time since fire. We did not find a difference in Clout's index between sites with or without glossies. So if you look at this graph, what I'm referring to is there's no difference between sort of the pale green boxes and the slightly darker green boxes within feed tree species. So there is a difference between the actual feed tree. So Littoralis has higher Clout's index in our survey than Torullosa, but no detections between those. So no differences between the sites. I do want to say that we pooled the data for sites, so we're not looking at individual trees. So that might be why we're sort of not seeing an effect. So other studies have looked at individual feed trees and compared those to non-feed trees. We didn't do that. We wanted to just kind of take a snapshot of the overall site. So there may actually be individual trees within this data that have a higher Clout's index if they were a feed tree, but we're not kind of seeing that here. We did have a couple of sites with coastal she oak, but not enough to kind of present any results. I've just excluded them from these graphs. Clout's index seemed to increase slightly with time since fire. So if you look here, the category 2, 3, and 4, it seems to increase a little bit. Unclear what's going on with soil type. So most of our sites were soil types 3 or 4. So there may be a difference here with soil type 4 having higher Clout's index. I'd just like to point out, Gay Crowley wrote a fantastic paper earlier this year on how soil type influences the food quality of she oak. So she may be talking about that later on. But yeah, there's probably some kind of effect, but potentially the way our survey was done doesn't allow for us to observe this very well. And then I'd also like to say that potentially looking at Clout's index is not the right thing. So Clout's index is fairly simple to measure because, like I said earlier, you just collect the cones, remove the seeds and weigh them, and you take the ratio. Kernel ratio may actually be more important. So what that would involve is actually cracking open those seeds to remove the kernels because, of course, the kernels are what the glossies eat, not just the seeds. And we did have a few sites where there was quite a few seeds within the cones, but those seeds seem to not actually have any kernels within them. So at the moment, that would be slightly biasing the interpretation of these results. So that's something for us to think about. In terms of cone density, there was potentially a slightly higher cone density at sites with glossies, but not much difference across time since fire categories. In terms of tree density, similarly, we think potentially slightly higher tree density at sites with glossies, mostly in the case of Littoralis. We did not find a difference in the proportion of adult female trees at sites with detections or not, and there was no real difference across time since fire categories. And similarly, no difference in tree sizes. So we basically, the she oaks were basically the same size across all of the sites. There may be some effect here in a difference between trees in category 1 versus category 5, but we really didn't have enough data in category 1 to really look at this properly. So what are we missing? The title of this talk is What We Don't Know. So look, we've investigated many site level variables. We did intensive vegetation surveys. We calculated a whole range of local landscape variables sort of within 500 meters of our survey sites, but it's not the whole story, and we know this, right? There's going to be a lot more to what's going on here. So I think importantly, we need to think about the broader landscape. So we know glossies prefer areas that have more contiguous habitat. They tend to avoid places that the habitat is really broken up. So urban areas they don't tend to occur in. Of course, exceptions. I know when I say that, there'll be heaps of people going, oh, but here they are in this urban area. And I know there are definitely exceptions, but by and large, they tend to occur in places with more habitat that isn't super broken up. And really importantly, I think we need to think about them as social species. So they are a social species. They may not be as social as other cockatoos. Their group sizes tend to be a bit smaller, but they do like to hang out with their friends. So this is probably something we need to think of. Probably one of the biggest predictors of where they occur would be where other birds have occurred nearby. Of course, fire is extraordinarily complex. I'm not a fire ecologist, so I'm sure there's lots of other ways we can kind of think about this, but sort of next steps for me will be to look at these interactions between time since fire and other variables. So things like drought, longer term patterns in climate, and fire severity. I think fire severity is probably one of the most important, but unfortunately it's actually really difficult to study because we don't have a lot of information apart from sort of like the recent fires within national park boundaries. We don't have a lot of information on fire severity. But the images that I've got there on the left-hand side, so the bottom image, so that's Main Range National Park, so part of so Glossy Black-Cockatoo habitat, and these were some sites that I visited post Black Summer when I was doing some surveys for the Queensland government. So that site, it experienced extreme intensity fire. When I went there, all of the she oaks were dead, absolutely no cones, and yeah, no glossies to be seen, no surprises at all. Sort of just around the corner in a site that experienced low intensity fire, so the top right image, I found glossies. So the trees did not experience canopy scorch. There were still cones on the trees, and the birds were happily feeding there roughly 12 months post Black Summer. So like I said earlier, it's not that we want to exclude all fire. That's certainly not the case, but extreme intensity fire is likely to be really detrimental for these birds. Then we have some really, really bizarre cases. So the top left image, so that is a photo I took in my backyard in Burleigh Heads. So that's a photo through my binoculars with my phone. I thought I was going crazy because I could hear these birds. I ran outside and there they were. And it's the one and only time that I've ever seen glossies in this area. I wouldn't have said the habitat was suitable for them. There's a few she oaks, but not that many. Not a whole lot by way of, big hollow-bearing trees or even water. It's highly urban. What on earth were they doing here? I still don't know. So potentially they were just sort of stopping over on their way to somewhere else. I'm not sure where. I don't know. I don't think they were going down to the beach. Potentially this was an older pair that maybe in past decades had come here when it was a bit more suitable. I don't know. Who knows? But it just goes to show that there's so much more about their movements, I think, that we don't yet understand. And we need to kind of think a bit more broadly. I'd just like to say all of these results, I've said this multiple times, but I'm still to do the formal modelling. So hopefully the next time I present this work, I can actually have some more interesting results to show you. So what's next for our project? We repeated a small number of surveys in 2023, but we were unfunded at that point. Really happy to say that we did receive some new funding from the Queensland government to repeat some surveys from 2024 to 2026. So we don't quite have enough money to resurvey all 100 sites, as wonderful as that would be. So we're just resurveying a subset of sites across the region, and we'll be doing this in breeding and non-breeding seasons. So we've just wrapped up our first survey. We're collecting the sound recorders at the moment, and then we'll be heading back there over summer. On Minjerribah, North Stradbroke Island, we're working with Kayak to have a look at how cultural burning might help glossies. And a key takeaway I want to say is that to really improve monitoring, to really get a handle on these population trends, we need to use the same methods in the same places year after year. And we have to get away from just monitoring hotspots. That there's some wonderful information we can get from that, but when we're talking understanding population trends, we need to be thinking, how can we design surveys that are more representative and unbiased and can actually tell us data when we do the same thing through time. This work is expensive, it's labor intensive, so I don't have a good solution for how to actually scale this up. And in some cases, I think, you know what, this is so hard. Like we're just constantly fighting for money and how are we going to do this? But I think there is an opportunity with citizen science. This would involve people going out, deploying sound recorders and picking them up a week later and then posting them in, potentially collecting some simple vegetation data. Of course, that would need to be coordinated by someone. Here in Southeast Queensland, that could potentially be the Conservancy, and elsewhere, some other groups. Of course, the big sort of issue with all of this is that the southeastern subspecies, or if we're talking about the whole East Coast, depending on how the taxonomy is revised, Southeast Queensland is only a tiny fragment of that, right? So monitoring 100 sites here is going to tell us what's going on in this region, but it's potentially not going to tell us the entire status of the subspecies. So really, we'd want to be doing this much more broadly. So if anyone has great ideas about how to do that, I'm all ears. Let's chat. Okay, so just to loop back to the very beginning, why save glossies? I think it's really, really important that we all take time to reflect on our why. And relatedly, what does it mean today to do conservation? I personally think that many conservationists are too conservative in their actions. And I think in this day and age, with the threats that we're facing, with basically runaway climate change, with extreme droughts, poor population sizes, all of the things, we have to be bolder. So I really believe that we have to act under this precautionary principle, which is, basically act now using the best available knowledge. So I think, of course, let's improve monitoring. Monitoring is literally my day job. It's what I do day in, day out. And I'm all for the best data and doing the very, very best we can, but we mustn't delay action. I've put a screenshot there of a paper that was led by David Lindenmayer. So this paper, I think, is about 10 years old now, but it's still very, very timely. And the title of that book, of that paper, was Counting the Books While the Library Burns. So yeah, let's not just count glossies. Let's really deal with the burning situation, literally and figuratively. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening to my talk. I'm really excited to be at this forum. I'm really excited to meet you all. Let's come together. Let's take this opportunity to learn from one another to help save glossies. And yes, thank you to the Australian government and the Queensland government for funding this research.
Thank you so much, Danny, for that fabulous talk. And there's already a heap of questions and discussion happening in the chat. So I thought we would go to the most popular thread so far, which is all about glossy black-cockatoo poo. And a few people have weighed into that conversation, but the question which was posed by Michael and a few people have chimed in with their opinion and experience is there any potential for glossy black-cockatoo poo to be used for detection at sites? And I'll just give you a rundown on the rest of the chat so far. So Mike Barth has said, it's not something easily found unless it's from a nest hollow or people actually see the bird defecating. Brian Hawkins has said it might be possible to train sniffer dogs to detect glossy black-cockatoo chewings or poos. And then Mike has rightly said, it really depends on what you're trying to do. It could be a good element to genetics work. So any opinions you have on this poo topic?
That wasn't the question I was expecting. No, I agree. I think yeah, I think there's definitely potential. I love the idea of sniffer dogs. Again, though, I think that's a pretty costly exercise and sort of return on investment. How much data are we going to get? But I think definitely there's potential there. Genetic data would be fabulous if we can do that. I mean, wonderful. I think that's probably really a missing element of this work. Yeah, I just wonder the feasibility. I mean, this is definitely not something I'm experienced in. So yeah, I probably don't have a lot more to say on that, but I think, yeah, particularly genetic information would be fantastic if we could get it. Yeah.
Great question, Michael, and a good way to get the discussion started.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question asked was actually from Simon from North Coast Local Land Services, and wanted to know if you found a way to classify acoustic detections, for example, birds passing by an acoustic recorder as opposed to birds feeding.
Yes, really, really good question. And this is really, really important when we're talking about occupancy monitoring, because we need to be able to differentiate when birds are actually using a site versus just kind of stopping over. So we can't take every single detection as evidence that the birds were actually using a place. So in the simplest case, we had what we call just some business rules. So if I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what they were, but it was basically if there was a single detection on a single day, we discounted that. So that did not mean, we took that to mean that the birds weren't necessarily using that site. So we did not count that as occupancy. If I think there was, God, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but it was something like more than 3 detections on a single day or any number of detections across multiple days, then that was taken as the birds using the site. But in terms of the actual call types, so that's, again, really, really cool and interesting. And this is why I love bioacoustics, because we can actually tell what call type they're giving. So there's certain call types that they give while they're feeding. So there's different kinds of contact calls. So we can look for those. And yeah, if you know what you're listening for, you can, tell the difference between a flight call or some other kind of alarm call, that kind of thing. But in my talk tomorrow, where I speak about bioacoustics, I do go through some of the other call types, those associated with breeding, that kind of thing, to kind of differentiate that. But it is a really good point, because if you're trying to do this kind of survey in feeding habitat, you really should be thinking about the sounds that indicate that they're feeding, because that's what you're trying to establish occupancy for. If you're trying to look for nesting sites, that's a completely different question, and you would be listening for different kinds of sounds.
Thanks, Danny. So Cheryl has asked whether this technology can be used for other bird species.
The AI technology, I'm guessing? Yeah,
acoustic monitoring and AI,
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So we have a whole session on this tomorrow. So yes, this is mostly what I do is actually not on Glossy. So it's monitoring all birds with sound. So basically any bird that makes sound or makes loud enough sound can be detected using acoustics. And sort of historically, the most tricky part of this approach was sort of processing the audio, trying to find those bird sounds. So of course we can't listen to all of those audio recordings. That's just completely not feasible. But today we have fantastic tools like BirdNet, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And if you haven't heard of BirdNet, go and download the app on your phone. It's fantastic. You can also use this kind of technology as like a desktop application in research, and you can tweak a whole bunch of parameters. You can actually build sort of like additional training data into those models. So for instance, for glossies, this isn't what we did because BirdNet wasn't around when we launched this project, but what we could do is basically take BirdNet and then get some more snippets of glossy's calls and plug it into BirdNet, and then it would actually become better for glossy. So it actually becomes sort of like a semi-custom model, and you can keep training that until it's fantastic, as good as you need it to be. So yeah, absolutely. I think acoustics for birds is wonderful.
That's great, Danny. Thank you. Roxanne Bowers has asked whether you can recommend any papers by yourself or others that discuss in detail methods used to train bioacoustic models for ecological monitoring. So maybe that's something, maybe that's something we can compile and get back to people after the forum.
Yes, certainly.
Great. Thanks for that question. So also, Danny, you mentioned a fabulous paper by Gay Crowley around soil types and glossy black cockatoo habitat. So I just want to confirm that Gay is presenting in the next session, actually, and a shout out for that session. So it starts at 11 a.m, about 45 minutes Queensland time, and it includes Professor Dominique Homburger, who's online now from Louisiana State University, Janet Carew from the Sunshine Coast, Trish Mooney from South Australia, as well as Gay Crawley from South Australia. So that's next. So a question from Lauren Hook, who says, great talk, Danny, and I'm sure everyone agrees. The habitat data is interesting. Have you been able to pull out breeding calls to find breeding areas?
So similar to before, we could, but we didn't in this case because we weren't looking for that. And yeah, I didn't quite touch on this before, but our first iteration of this survey sort of crossed breeding and non-breeding seasons, which is definitely not ideal for an occupancy survey. So we probably actually need to split that data into breeding and non-breeding, because of course the birds might be using different places, so occupying different habitat. But yeah, we can definitely be looking just for those breeding calls, particularly the calls that are associated with actual nests. I mean, things like, you know, I know this is not just specific to nests, but things like the courtship display call is so detectable because there's not much else that sounds like it. You know, other cockatoos that give a similar call, but the structure of the call for glossies is different and it's so detectable. Begging calls and that can be a little bit more tricky because, I mean, not to my ears, but it kind of sounds like a, you know, screeching self-crested cockatoo sometimes. You know, when I say looks, I mean the machine learning algorithm looks at the image of the spectrogram and compares them. So sometimes it gets mixed up. So sometimes that's not the best, but yeah, those other nest associated calls, certainly. And that is how we find new nests for the red-tailed black cockatoos, for instance, that I work on as well down in Victoria and South Australia. So we do have sound recorders out there at potential nesting areas, and we're listening for those specific nest associated calls. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Danny. Brian Hawkins has just made an observation that in New South Wales, there's a Bats in Backyards program that involves mailing out acoustic recorders to people to put up in their backyard. So that could be a good model for citizen science engagement in monitoring glossy black cockatoos. Larissa, who's in Canberra, has a question or a statement. She says, is this the beginning? Do we then move on to identifying total population by identifying individuals? For example, once we know X number of birds have been heard, are they the same bird moving around different areas, or are they different individuals? I assume this is a project of genetics or Flossie identification. Any comment on that? Danny and Larissa, if I missed something there, feel free to turn your mic on and chime in. Thoughts, Danny?
Yes. Yeah, many thoughts. So occupancy monitoring, the way that we're implementing it, does not sort of deal with abundance at all. So it's basically just are the birds present or not at the sites. So that is one, I don't want to say a flaw because that's not what it's designed to do, but we would need some kind of complementary methods to get at that approach. There's many, many challenges with measuring bird abundance from acoustic data. Or abundance of any animals from acoustic data. So I actually am working on this in a separate project for woodland birds, but it's a real challenge. Sound recorders are quite different to camera traps, which I think people really compare them a lot, but a camera trap basically has a fixed sort of field of view, and you can basically, I mean, you can count the number of individuals within a field of view, and then there's different metrics that have been developed for, you know, relative abundance from camera trap images. Acoustic recorders, the detection space around a microphone is really dynamic. So that changes, I mean, it changes with the type of sound recorder you use, which is really, really important if you're using multiple, you know, different kinds of sound recorders in projects. So that's a no-no. You know, I know budget, you know, money is limited, but that's a real problem. The habitat that you're in affects how sound propagates through that habitat, whether it's been raining, whether it's windy, what the other species are calling. There's just so much that makes sound detection space really dynamic and difficult to count birds from. So that's like a whole area of research that is, I think, one of the next frontiers actually of acoustics. Little bit off topic, but we've got some cool work. It's not led by me, but some other people, where they're using multiple microphones at each site to then triangulate the position of individual birds at sites. So you can actually get kind of density or some kind of measure of abundance at sites if you have multiple microphones, at least 3 microphones, so we can kind of like pinpoint the locations. But again, extremely costly to do that. In terms of identifying individuals, so yes, we can. So very, very early days. We're not doing this for glossies at the moment, but I am involved in a project on southeastern redtails where we're doing this. And yeah, this is led by a PhD student from Monash. So I won't kind of speak too much on his behalf, but we're basically able to identify the individual red-tailed black cockatoo from their sound. So just like you would from photo ID. And the way we know this is because we've built such a good database of audio from nests where we know the birds. So we know that the same birds are going to the nest. So we have the identity of those birds, and then we're able to train these AI models to then look for those birds in broader audio data sets. So it's working surprisingly well. And certainly I was in a meeting last week where a whole range of people from all around the world were talking about the potential for individual ID from sound. So certainly I think watch this space. I reckon it's going to become more and more applicable. Some species though, like potentially glossies, because so basically parrots can change their vocalizations throughout the course of their life. So they're not a fixed call like some other birds. They can't. So basically what they learn in early life is what they will sound like forever, whereas parrots can change. They can mix and match the different kinds of sound types they create, and their voices, so to speak, change through time. So there may be sort of an instability in the call type through time. So that's an important thing to think of. But all of that said, I would just like to get to the point where we could maybe not tell exactly who the bird is. So we may not know that that's Bob, but we know that that bird is different to another bird. So we could get some kind of count. So if we had sound recorders at like drinking sites, we would potentially know that there's maybe somewhere between 10 to 12 individuals at that site. We can tell that they're different individuals based on their call structure. So yeah, super, super exciting.
Yeah, I probably don't need to tell you there's some people in the chat getting very excited about the potential for individual bird IDs from acoustics. So how progressive is that? Dee has asked a question, which I actually think you've already answered, but and that's around whether you're able to or whether you will add different call types to bird ID apps.
Yeah. So I've sort of answered that, but at the moment, the models that we have just identify the species. So it'll return a whole bunch of hits and it'll just say Glossy Black-Cockatoo. And then I go and check that and say, yes or no, it's a glossy. But then I manually go and state which call type that is. So that's still a bit of a manual process. So yes, what we should be doing is actually training these models. We call that like a multi-label classification. So we can go through and then the model will say Glossy Black-Cockatoo, courtship call, Glossy Black-Cockatoo, begging call, Glossy Black-Cockatoo, nestling call, whatever. So I think, yeah, we can definitely do that. We haven't at this point because, we just haven't.
Yeah. Mike Barth's just chimed in and said males and females definitely sound different. And there's just one more question and then we'll wrap up this session. And that question is from Lauren Hook, who wants to know, were you able to get a snapshot census looking at how many calls were recorded in a short period of time across all sites? And did you get a total known herd to be alive across your sample area?
So no. And no, but we could potentially do that. So no, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Maybe I can chat to Lauren. But yeah, we don't have an estimate of like minimum number known to be alive from this information. But yeah, we could slice and dice the acoustic data in different ways to get various estimates of counts of calls, that kind of thing. So all that information is there. It would just be a matter of mining the data slightly differently.
Thank you, Danny. Before you leave this session, if you are all able to complete an evaluation form, if you're intending to come to other sessions, you can do this during other sessions. Obviously, this being our first national forum, we'd really appreciate any insights and feedback as you go. You can complete it multiple times over the day. Thank you so much, Danny, for that presentation. What a fabulous way to kick off this forum and give us a bit of an overview of the work that Danny and other people have been doing. Any reflections, you're more than welcome to drop in the chat, but there has already been heaps of comments about how useful this presentation has been, Danny. I wanted to remind you all of the next session and some of the other sessions coming up today. We have, in the next session, we are looking at habitat and feeding habits of glossy black-cockatoos. Sorry, I'm just going to bring it up on my screen. We have, and that starts in about 35 minutes time. Then after that, we have a session on artificial nesting, which starts at 1 p.m. Queensland time. And that includes experiences from South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. Later this afternoon, we have a session on habitat conservation in agricultural landscapes with perspectives again from 2 different states this time. Later this afternoon, we have a session on Flossy ID. We have a cockatail hour, which is actually a cockatail half hour. So if you haven't checked the program, we're asking you to dress in red and black highlights. Please don't go and buy plastic feather boas though. And we are going to use this 30 minutes to just decompress on the day that's been, and also challenge people to use either AI or their own intelligence to create the best or worst poem about glossy black-cockatoos. And then we're wrapping up the day with a citizen science panel from 6:30 p.m. Queensland time, and we do apologise to those people in the southern states that it's quite a late night. So thank you, Danny. In wrapping up, I just wanted to share a comment from Leanne because it kind of sums up why we are all here. And Leanne says, amazing presentation, Danny, thank you. This has inspired me to make more time to do more monitoring on my own private land and to learn as much as I can about these birds who I'm fortunate enough to share my land with at certain times of the year. I have so many tree hollows that I'm planning to monitor as well, and as well as setting up wildlife cameras. I love these birds when they fly in. Taking photos and videos are a joy. To have a diary of their existence here and trees that they like to feed from, and water such as dams and billabongs they love to drink from. Last year they flew in and 2 out of the flock chose a tree to roost in beside the dam, and they would all drink at dawn and dusk. I'm hoping this year we see these same patterns. So thank you for sharing all of your knowledge. You are an inspiration. So thank you for that, Leanne. Thank you all for joining us. We will reconvene in 35 minutes